Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We are so happy you chose to spend some time with us, and we are looking forward to a very enlightening discussion from the New Orleans area and the exciting things going on down there. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Randall Maxey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens. Welcome, everybody. And I'm going to say afternoon. It's a sunny day here in California. I don't know what it is in Florida or Tennessee right now. But I'm so pleased that Dr. Ron K. Bailey has agreed to come on the program today and discuss interesting ideas. I wonder if it's symbolic that he and two of our frequent flyers in terms of lectures and presentations here have been in the field of psychiatry. So in addition to Dr. Lawson is Dr. Bailey. I don't know who's given the most talks, but Dr. Bailey has given a series of talks on interpersonal and domestic violence. He's talked about gun violence and a number of things. But today, he informed me when we spoke a few days ago that the imprisoned, incarcerated population in Louisiana is, in certain areas at least, is 93% Black. That is extremely disturbing. And I know we don't do 93% of the crime that happens, but the way it's enforced and who's included in that is symbolic. And we hope that he touches on these issues. Dr. Ron K. Bailey is a physician who I met years ago. He's a past president of the National Medical Association. He's been department head of several prominent schools, including Bowman Gray, Meharry Medical School. He's been recently at Charles Drew Medical College, and now is the first Black department chair at Louisiana State University. And I'm very proud of him. And he's built a really good team. He's written several books. I'm sure he'll speak about it, but more importantly, he has a statewide contract for correctional health in Louisiana. And he's brought some of his team along. I'll let him introduce him. Dr. Ron Bailey, we're grateful that you've taken time to address the Black Health Trust. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maxey. Very happy to be on a program with a fine man as yourself, also a past president of the National Medical Association. Much respect and much love. I always enjoy being on Black Health Trust. Well-organized, well-run, well-delineated program. I've known Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens for a long time, outstanding in her way, as well as your entire team, Dr. Walks as well. I think I mentioned as a member of the audience a few weeks back that I have been talking about getting this contract for some time. I always mention, I won't forget to mention today, that the first person to mention to me years ago, at least 5 or 6, that African-American psychiatrists should pursue these jail, prison, healthcare contracts was Dr. Randall Maxey. So I will always give him full credit for putting that bug in my ear. Whether we discussed it at length or not that day, I'm pretty sure what I heard him saying and what I think he was meaning was the reality is that many other people may not pursue this type of work because of the stigma against persons who've been incarcerated or arrested in jail or prison. And of course, jails are different than prisons. We'll speak about that more later. But the reality is that's not a luxury we have to allow ourselves as African-American doctors, because so many individuals, period, I argue so many African-American individuals particularly, and as a Black psychiatrist, I would add further, so many African-American persons with chronic mental illness, more specifically, are arrested and detained, if not fully incarcerated, in jail or prison settings. And they, like all other human beings alive in the world, need and require and deserve competent health care. In addition, it's also clear that the dynamics and the metrics of our jail settings have changed dramatically during my now 30-year career. I was sharing with somebody earlier today that the numbers show that in 1990, we probably had about 700,000 people in the country in jail or prison. About 30 years later, by 2020, that number tripled to about 2.2 million. We all read the data that on any given day, 2/3 of all of the African American men in Washington, D.C. are either incarcerated on some form of conditional release. They're outside on release, but it's conditioned. They're on probation or parole or some degree of legal interaction. I'd end by saying it's also true that we have a demographically changing jail and prison population. Frankly, many are older. Many jails out there actually are more like nursing homes than they are like correctional settings, and they're sicker. Many jails are more like hospitals than they are like simply places to institutionalize and maintain someone so they kind of get back out and function normally. So for all of those reasons and all that background, and thank you for your patience. Let me kind of go through all of that. We need to take a very different look, I think, longitudinally, so I'd even argue holistically, at jails and prisons, who's there, how we treat them, how we pay for the health care that occurs there, and how we use those opportunities to be much more proactive and preventative in our approaches, I think ways that are particularly likely to benefit the Black community in our society going forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. You have guests with you?
I do. So I also want to thank Dr. Maxey. Also gives me a chance to, advocate for and promote my young people. I think this is at least the fourth time I've had one of your shows and got to bring somebody from my department on. So I want to thank you personally for that. Today we have Dr. Whitney Milton. Dr. Milton is currently finishing a second year in residency here in psychiatry at LSU School of Medicine, New Orleans. She's in good standing, doing outstanding work for us, has already shared that she may be interested in pursuing a child fellowship. And I think your listeners would know the need to recruit and retain and graduate more people, period, and definitely more African-American females in the areas of child psychiatry. Let me give her the floor. Dr. Milton?
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate the discussion, and I also I think it's important in training to really understand the current issues that are going on in the community so that you can be able to be an answer to a problem, and you can even incorporate some of these issues into your career trajectory. And so I definitely have plans to work with the juvenile justice system. That's one of my big interests. And so I look forward to this conversation.
Well, good. I'm going to throw a curveball, Dr. Bailey. In looking at our system of corrections, looking at our system of justice, it seems that until recently, we were looking at how the system of justice is fairly just. Lady Justice wears a blindfold and has the balance. But now, since certain former office holders have been criminally convicted, that all of a sudden it seems that it's not a good system anymore. Or is there a different way of looking at the system according to what ethnic group you hail from, what community you hail from, and how does that bother the treatment of individuals who are incarcerated?
Yeah, it's a tremendous point, an unfortunate one, but I think a salient one and frankly an accurate one. We, by definition, have had a two-tiered system of healthcare, I think, in the U.S. Throughout the entirety of my now 34-year career, and probably preceding that. All too often, if you had insurance, you received one level of care. If you didn't, if you received government support, Medicaid, or if you had no support at all, you may receive, I think, a different level, maybe argue an inferior level of care. And some might argue that jail care or prison care may be viewed as being even lower than that. It's unfortunate for many reasons. One, the reality is what we do in one community, in one setting, by definition, can adversely impact persons in other areas. It goes without saying, if COVID was contagious, you can't just treat people who have private insurance for such prophylactically. If other settings persons will have it, you would never get to that magic number that you guys talked about so well, I think, on this show, that you had to get the 70 to 75% of people vaccinated before you begin to decrease the overall risk, just because of the construct, how people could be so impacted. I also think the one other problem, though, is that, and one issue we're making a big issue on here in New Orleans, and I've been going after this contract for 3 years. So we put a lot of effort on this going back to late 2021. Finally got it in December 23, and we started last month, or last week, June 24. But it's such a missed opportunity, Dr. Maxey, in healthcare and society. If persons are in a concentrated setting and we don't provide optimized care for them. Individuals in jails and prisons die of the same reason that people outside jails and prisons die: heart disease, diabetes, and stroke and cancer. If we don't treat persons within those settings, we miss opportunity to decrease the likelihood that they actually may have tertiary, untreated, and managed illness. We also miss opportunity to preventatively get on top of some problems that they may decrease the likelihood they may actually have bigger issues that are more costly and much more difficult to treat later on. So I think that your point is well spoken. We need leaders in government and university settings that I think have a much more broad spectrum view of such. We need to, I think, invest in optimized care of such a larger, growing, medically fragile patient population earlier, rather than waiting and doing it later when it's a tertiary, less likely to be peripherally effective and more costly.
That's Neighbor Stevens.
So, Dr. Bailey, I was intrigued by the comment that you made in your introductory remarks regarding the change in demographics of the prison population. And I was wondering if we could dig a little deeper into that, especially since it seems like so many of our young men and growing numbers of our young women are finding themselves caught up in the justice system. Can you kind of explain this dichotomy and demographic that you're seeing?
Certainly. I think that the demographics are changing for a variety of reasons. One, first and foremost, quantitatively, as indicated, as more people are going to jail and prison now than ever before. We have policy or create laws that I think make that part of our reality. 3 strikes you're out, you stay for a longer period of time. More and more laws. In some states, the laws are inconsistent. Marijuana is legal in one state, is illegal in a different state. Now there's attempts to arrest people in the past did not get arrested for concerns. You may arrest doctors, for example, for being involved in what we historically in my profession have always called D&C. Lay folks call it abortion, but that can be an arrestable criminal offense in some settings based on new or changing laws. So for a lot of reasons, more people quantitatively end up finding themselves on the wrong side, I think, of the criminal justice system. So more people are in jail or prison. I also think it's a lot more likely that we have rules now that are less, I think, aware, I think, of the practical realities of being in jail or prison, Dr. Neighbor Stevens. Many places now, judges will argue that their hands are tied. They can't make decisions that show rationality and allow them some rational judgment in what they might do. So, for example, if somebody is accused or convicted of something at an elderly age, probably was in times in the past, you're a lot more likely to be in a hospital kind of setting, a nursing home, for example, versus a jail or prison. But if you have rules that state that, the judge is mandatory time and mandatory sentencing and mandatory years, one thing that's changed, I think, demographically, that I think many Americans are just simply not aware of, again, why I thank you for having me on your show today, is we simply have an older, more medically fragile patient population. And at times, because the laws made by policy from politicians and leaders in government don't allow for the nuances to be assessed and for there to be any leniency or flexibility on the part of judges who may be looking at someone who really can't function. I think I saw a case on television a few days ago where a person, kind of a big name person who ended up in that setting, was essentially, walking on a cane, and they were walking him into the jail prison setting. He'd probably have to be in 101 his whole time, be very expensive, was on very expensive medications, didn't seem to have much physicality ability to run from police, let alone hurt someone. but our rules say that person had to go to a jail or prison setting for a long period of time. So I think these are some reasons why it's happening. And I think it's surprising to all of us, never more so than if you ever get to really walk in a prison, which I've always thought is one of the other challenges in our society. Many folks who are making these rules never actually walk into the prison on their own, and that's kind of part of the problem.
Can Dr. Walsh be unmuted?
Dr. Milton?
Dr. Walks.
Walks, yeah, okay.
Okay. While he's getting unmuted, the question I have, you gave statistics on what percentage of the population is African American or Black. Are there any like statistics? How many of our Black families have relationships or have relatives who are incarcerated? How big is how much does it touch the rest of us who aren't incarcerated?
Yeah, and I should speak clearly to that. Yeah, I mentioned Dr. Maxey, I think, offline, that we took over this jail or prison setting Monday. And I knew some of the data before, but Monday's a nice, good demarcation cutoff day. And we got all our numbers. And day one, there were 1,210 human beings in the Orleans Parish prison. It's been called OPP for years. As an aside, technically it is a prison because the average stay there is 423 days. And by definition, to be a prison, people generally should stay there more than a year. Historically, if you had a felony, you stay in jail more than a year. Go to prison. If it was if you're pre-adjudication, you've been arrested but hadn't gone to court yet, or you got a sentence that was less than a year for a misdemeanor, you'd be there less than a year. One challenge now is that many places like Louisiana, which unfortunately is the number one per capita state in the country, but a number of people per capita in jail or prison just have kind of run out of prison beds at prisons. So more persons stay in jails longer and longer, waiting to get a prison bed. So very often you do have a more violent population in jails, where normally you do a violent crime, you get arrested, you quickly go through the process, and you're sent off to a prison farm, they call it, a long distance away. So having a longer period of time in jails is adverse. It's more high risk. There's certainly more danger internally, particularly for staff and other inmates. It also, I think, throws off the construct that the type of way we interface with people in a healthcare setting is very different. If you're in a jail and you're going to average 30 days or less, which happens in most jails around the country, versus if you're in a place where you're going to stay longer, like a prison, where you're there for longer than a year. That being said, the point that I made to Dr. Maxey earlier was that on day one, we found there were 210 people, I think, in the Orleans Parish jail or prison, 93% of which, and this is not a typo, 93%, as I understand correctly, and I just repeated to me 3 times, make sure I wouldn't misspeak today, were Black males. And that's just a phenomenal number. Dr. Maxey mentioned earlier in his introduction, probably not 93% of people committing crimes, let alone violent crimes, but convicted of crimes, are African American and male. But that number is just so out of touch with the percentages of individuals, African American and other settings.
So inherent in my question, 2 things. Out of all of our families, what percentage of Black families have relatives who've been incarcerated? That's one. And of these people being incarcerated, how many are there for psychiatric illnesses versus criminal illnesses?
Yes, sorry, you asked that question, I didn't answer. I'm gonna give you a good answer. The data's clear. Over a third of African American families in America today have a direct first or second degree relative either in or has been to prison. Now the number increases when you include persons who are more than second generation, which generally is your first or second cousin. If you go way down the line, of course, the numbers can grow. It also increases if you include jails, because a lot of folks know somebody who's been in jail. You could have a political disturbance against war and get arrested and go to jail overnight, and then you kind of bond out or whatever. For most Americans, that's viewed as being very different. So you have a relative, as many of us do, who's actually going to prison and go through the whole process and have to go away for a year or more, many individuals for multiple years, if not more than a decade. Dr. Maxey, you're right in that question. It does, for many, change the secret sauce of how we understand this issue of somebody going to prison, somebody maybe that you grew up with as a relative and you knew them very, very well. Maybe they were not any different than anybody else. Maybe they were not violent. It does kind of speak to, I think, some of the problems in our system. They're systemic. Some of the problems, I think, in the processing. Clearly, the issue of whether somebody has enough fiscal support, finances to pay for and afford what I'll call the most expensive and sometimes the best form of a legal defense, the way things work in our society. A lot of issues come into play. But the answer to your question is a third of American African blacks note having a first or second degree relative who's been to prison and stayed there for over a year.
And the second part of that question was, I know if you rob a bank, you should go to prison. But what about those who have schizophrenia or depression, or what population are in there because of mental illness versus criminal illness, if I'm being clear?
You are being clear. I think that we are very aware that our jails and our prisons have become mental health institutions. There's so much that the number clearly, we would argue, would be over half in many settings. Here in New Orleans, I mean, I have these recent numbers. In the Orleans Parish Prison or Orleans Criminal Justice Center Jail, the name is changing. But in the local jail where we were working the last week, the caseload for mental health is 43% of 1,210 people. So right about half meet criteria for the three, what people like Walks and I call the big diagnoses. And the big three are schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder with psychotic features. So that 43% does not include individuals with what some would argue are smaller diagnoses. In the old days, the big ones we call psychosis, the small ones we call neurosis, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, that type thing. So it's pretty clear to me that over half of the persons there, over half of the 1,200, have some degree of active diagnosed psychiatric illness, and almost half have what I'd call SPMI, or we call serious and persistent mental illness.
Okay. Have we been able to unmute Dr. Ivan Walks yet?
I think we have, Dr. Maxey. Dr. Bailey, always a pleasure and an honor to have you on Black Health Trust, and I want to welcome Dr. Milton as well. Dr. Bailey, this tremendous opportunity you have, and as not only a psychiatrist, but a noted researcher and scientist, you have an opportunity to look at mental health within that correction setting. And my question would be, there are times when just getting someone's attention about something that they have gives you an opportunity to move forward with it differently. Do you feel that as you all proceed with this particular project, this very important project, that you'll be able to maybe get folks to understand their mental health contribution to their behavior, maybe get their families to be able to support them more in a treatment plan that is more longer term? Because it seems like the folks who, a lot of the folks who are coming in and out of prison have this mental health challenge, and it goes untreated successfully. So that question about, can we, while we have them in front of us, begin looking at some long-term solutions?
I appreciate you very much, Dr. Ivan Walks, as well. Mutual admiration, a great career, and a great work I think you do on Black Health Trust. You always kind of get me thinking, which I really appreciate. I'll take an initial stab at this, and I'm gonna kind of punt this one to my associate, Dr. Milton, because some of her, she and I were discussing just today some work she's doing, I think, at one of our teaching hospitals, where some of this may actually kind of come into play for her as well. But my first stab at it would be to say, yes, I clearly think it's an outstanding opportunity for us for a lot of reasons. I think part of what Dr. Maxey was saying to me 4 or 5 years ago when he said, Bailey, Black psychiatrists should be involved in this game, is that Black psychiatrists who touch these big universities have a lot of resources. And I'll just share with you, this particular facility is on now and has been on for almost a decade, what they call a consent decree, where the federal government comes in and kind of takes over and says, you're doing such a bad job, we've got to watch things, make sure you don't hurt people in a worse way. Milton and I were discussing earlier today, what are some of the metrics when the federal government will come in for a consent decree? I made the example, if you own a cleaners and you were cleaning people's shirts bad and not good, the federal government could care less and you lose your business because customers just will stop coming and not paying. But if you're running a hospital, it's not a mistake we could allow you to make the first time to be remarkably, absent in your responsibility to meet some minimum expectations of performance. And that's why the federal government has a different role to play in the public health dimension. And that's why, and they use a consent decree to actualize, I think, that responsibility for overall American health. That's a public health kind of concern. I think that we have 78 doctors in this LSU system, and over 100 trainees and students and residents. So this one thing we really have very often is volume. And with that volume, we can get people seen. So one of the components, I think, of the mental health consent decree is just simply they couldn't see people. So a person would go into the jail setting on a Friday night, and regardless of what they arrested you for, whether it was right or wrong, and all the legal issues, if you're a 58-year-old man like I am with high blood pressure, you got to see somebody to give you medication. But you can't bring your own medication from your house. And if nobody sees you for 2 weeks, you're in trouble. I mean, it was that level of a problem in a jail setting when you just have to have doctors and clinicians. People just got to be seen. We take for granted when you go to a hospital, we all been trained in hospitals or whatever, that you go to the emergency room and somebody will just see you. But that doesn't have to happen. If nobody's there, if nobody comes to work, if there's nobody on, if there's one social worker in the hospital with 1,200 patients or whatever, you just don't get seen for a month when you put in your request because you got a complaint, whether it's a headache or whether you got chest pain. So I think that's one of the issues, volume. I think the other issue that Dr. Walks points out is this issue of family. And man, you're 100% right. Getting families to move away from, again, the stigma that society places on individuals who's going to jail or prison, getting families to acknowledge that it's better to be in healthcare then I think this argues better to be in jail than in a psych hospital. I disagree with that, but I think there's been some conservation on that line, I think, in some communities, maybe even ours in some regard. And this idea that you deserve competent and proficient and humane health care, whether you're in jail or not, is a point that we cannot emphasize enough. And when we don't do so, we do it at our own detriment and people's lives are at risk. So I appreciate the question. Dr. Milton, did you want to add any thoughts about how things are going in residency on those kind of issues?
So I'm very fortunate that our program is innovative because we live in a community that is post-Katrina. And so a lot of people have mental health issues and trauma. But in our particular program, in our main teaching hospital, we have a separate psychiatric ER. And that actually does help because we can have individuals that are either, brought on their own volition or someone who has a serious mental health history. Their family can go and get a order of protection that actually brings them directly to our emergency room for evaluation. And so we do have more opportunities to differentiate people who are, engaging in criminal activity versus, activity or behavior that is related to their mental health. And so we see these patients in the ER, the psychiatric ER, and they can be admitted. And so I think that that is very innovative that we have this system. The police are aware of the system. We actually have the Metro Crisis Unit that can go out and if someone's having a disturbance, they can differentiate whether someone needs to go to a facility for criminal activity versus the psychiatric hospital. And I think that that's one way to move the needle and be able to differentiate people who need these different types of institutions.
I see Dr. Michelle Clark, a distinguished psychiatrist in Oakland, has her hand up. Can we recognize her?
Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I say anything, I want to show my respect for Dr. Randall Maxey, who has kept this program going for so many years and brought so many outstanding speakers and topics to the fore with outstanding discussion. It's because of him that I have become the psychiatrist that I am due to his excellent tutelage during my third year of medical school as my senior resident. So I want to thank you, Dr. Maxey, once again. And it's a wonderful privilege to share the podium with my colleague, who I can call friend, Ron Bailey. And it's always good to see Dr. Walks and Dr. Neighbor. I wanted to share with you that I have been working in the field of correctional health for the past 30 years. Having done so because that's where my people are. And I started out in consultation and liaison because I noticed how many people suffered with their general health because of their mental health. But having done that, I saw that the greater need was in the correctional area. We need to really get behind the concept of restorative justice, particularly with our population of people who are in the jails and prisons. I don't think there is a Black family in the United States that does not have a relative who has been or currently is in prison, including mine. To answer your question, Dr. Maxey, and to answer your question, Dr. Nabert Stevens, about the increased incidence, particularly of young women, we're looking at the vicissitudes of the First World War, Second World War. We can go all the way back to the Civil War, and the lack of intact families being able to support those that run afoul of the law, etc. It's part of all of the social determinants of health. I wanted to speak to the issue of diagnosis. And one of the things that has happened is the deterioration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, particularly in terms of the inclusion of information about African Americans. And in correctional health particularly, what I have found in the prison population, both those in and those coming out, which is a population that I work with now, is rampant misdiagnosis of African American due to lack of cultural competence, including even understand Black language and the way we express ourselves, the lack of investigation about nutritional deficiencies, head injuries, substance abuse. A lot of times these diagnoses are made in the context of substance abuse and people are misdiagnosed. And research has gone on finally when Black researchers were able to get funding to do research to make it very clear that Blacks are inordinately diagnosed as schizophrenic, particularly paranoid type, and bipolar. And in blind studies, when they blind the chart information to the race, almost invariably those with bipolar disorder are diagnosed as schizophrenic, etc. So I think it's very important to understand in this population, people are treated for diagnoses that they do not have. And when you have the wrong diagnosis, you cannot formulate the correct treatment plan. So the struggle has been for me to educate those that I'm working with around this issue, who are mostly these days nurse practitioners. And that's a whole nother conversation that I won't get into now. Currently, I'm the medical director for the Felton Institute Justice Services Programs, and we have now 8 programs that are addressing mental health needs of people who are in and out of the carceral systems. 2 of our programs work with patients coming out with substance abuse. 3 of our programs work with patients coming out with identified mental disorders. We also have this year, for the first time, a residential program that is working with those who are IST, incompetent to stand for trial because of mental disorder. And instead of languishing in the system for years waiting for a state hospital bed, these patients are taken to mental health diversion court and entered into our program into residential care with culturally similar staffing because we hire staff who are formerly incarcerated. And a lot of these people are people with excellent talents. They have degrees, some of them advanced degrees, working with his clients to model how to successfully remain in the community. I won't belabor this any longer, but I want to say that I live in a rarefied situation in the state of California because they started in 1981 looking at restorative justice and creating programs for people coming out of jails and prison. Thank you for giving me the time to speak. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Dr. Bailey, any comments on what Dr. Clark had to
absolutely. Dr. Clark described, I think, a very high level, I would argue, fairly sophisticated process. And having been in California for a short time myself, 2 or 3 years, I can acknowledge that California and New York, probably the states that kind of lead the way very often on many of these kinds of thoughts, ideas. That the issue of restorative justice makes so much sense. We don't win in society when we throw people away, like we throw them in the trash can, with their physical health being ignored any more than their psychological and mental health being underappreciated, undervalued, and not really responded to. The reality is those persons don't just kind of go away. They remain involved in our society. And I think we may be struggling in getting to a critical mass all too often. You can only have so many people in jail or prisons who you've kind of taken out of society. They're not working a job. They're not a so-called productive member of society in that regard, paying taxes and volunteering at the local baseball game. They're not, helping keep other people, young people, on a straight and narrow. It's not a zero-sum game where there could be an endless number of persons, and jails and prisons can just continue to grow. So we need programs like what Dr. Clark mentioned, and I'm very happy to hear her describe it very, very directly. Those are the kind of things we actually need in places like Louisiana. Like I mentioned earlier, we're unfortunately, I'm not sure we'll say we're number 1 or 50th, depending on how you want to describe it, but certainly worse in the country as far as the number of people in jail or prison divided by the number of people in the state. About 4.5 million people in prison here. And again, the prisons are so overcrowded that many people have to stay in jail. They can't even be sent to the faraway prison because there's just no bed availability. That's a tragedy of tragedies here. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing it in many states around the country. I also think that what Dr. Clark's comments aspire to are giving healthcare a chance. And I got a lot of respect for that. In fact, I admire it. I think all too often in my career, and I've been in different states, but I've been in some southern states, not always in California. I was in Connecticut for a while, on the East Coast a bit. But some of these states, if you want to ignore healthcare and ignore research and data, and ignore empirical data and what it says may be best practices models of what you should do, you end up, I think, with bad outcomes. My example is not exactly a jail outcome, but I have probably mentioned this before, but I've been involved in a gun violence discussion, debate, research for a long time. Dr. Maxey mentioned earlier, I've written 2 books on it, if you will. And it was called the Dickey Amendment. And I think although it's not exactly an issue for correctional health care, I think it's very apropos for today's discussion. Dickey was a congressman, he's dead now, in Arkansas, that was most responsible for, although he wasn't alone, in pushing the issue that Congress did not want to hear any data, empirically based or otherwise, that might make the argument that we should support gun reform. So a lot of reasons why I so want to write a gun reform book or a gun violence book, as I did, are to have data on the evening news, for them to just say a study just came out that said XYZ. Is it so difficult to get any federal government funding if you're in initial abstract stage, you actually try to look at what are the ramifications of guns and gun violence. I'll end by saying I would argue, one of the reasons why it's so hard to argue against bad laws. I mean, right now there's a law, I think that passed in Louisiana this year for open carry. I mean, so other states may have some similar laws, and you'd like to say, well, there's been 1 or 2 or 18 studies that have shown that this is a bad idea. This may end up, costing more lives in society than saving lives. But if you don't do the research on it, because the research dollars have been blocked because of the Dickey Amendment, you end up just guessing and kind of sharing platitudes at one another based on what people's emotions are. That's within how scientists operate. We should operate, I think, with the so-called null hypothesis. You make a determination. You say, this is what I think, and you go and do a research project to either prove it or disprove it, and let the results fall where they may. So, thanks, Dr. Clark. I think tremendous points and issues that we should take some ideas from and get some advice from. We would definitely like to do a better job with healthcare in the jail or prison system here in Louisiana going forward than many would argue happened in the past.
Dr. Neighbor-Stevens?
There's so much that every week we talk about something, and there's just so much work that needs to be done. One can easily feel overwhelmed. And I congratulate Dr. Bailey for staking out an area, a couple of areas actually, where he's trying to make a difference. I keep thinking about the last scene in a movie that I saw, Why Beale Street Sings the Blues. That last scene where the family is wrenched apart and you can just see and feel the pain in that in the son. And I was wondering, yes, the person who's incarcerated absolutely needs a lot of help and support. But are you going to be able, do you think, to also impact, hopefully positively, the families of the incarcerated so that we don't have a intergenerational impact of the injustices that are going on currently and the cycle keeps repeating itself?
Timely. I think it's timely. I think that really is the question of the day. I hope that my earlier comments lead along that line, and if not, I hope I can strengthen and fine tune my message going forward. Because exactly the point I'd like to make when we talk about this issue to the City Council. We hope to get the chance to talk about this to the state house on criminal justice, etc. I'd say a couple of things. I'm going to punt this one as well to Dr. Milton, because with her interest in going to child psychiatry, that should be, and maybe even forensic psychiatry as well, that should be kind of right down her alley. Interested in hearing what a young person thinks about how to do so. But I'll tell you what we have already done. First and foremost, we clearly need to get families involved early in the process. So I think, Dr. Neighbor-Stevens, we should look at jails or prisons like halfway houses. And this is the language that really comes from the sheriff. We had a new sheriff. Her name is Susan Hudson. Very proud of her, very impressed with her. She was running for office when I arrived here in June of 21, won an election, I think that fall, October, November, took over, I think, in the spring of 22. So she'll be the sheriff for 4 years until I think it's March or April of 26. And she wants to improve healthcare. And she also wants to improve, I think, the lives of people getting out of jail or prison. One of her big issues is when you get out, you have someplace to go. And that's what I always think as a psychiatrist of a halfway house. My whole career, we would spend a lot of time with somebody in the hospital. And before we got ready to discharge them, part of discharge planning, which is a point that one of you mentioned earlier on today's call, was to figure out where they were going to go, how they were going to get their medications, did they have an appointment set up? We spent a lot of time in that space early in my career. We didn't just discharge somebody, but then very quickly be lost to follow-up or become homeless and can't get any treatments. So getting families involved early in a jail setting, I think is very similar to a hospital, where the day you get admitted to a hospital, we're thinking about what you're going to look like the day you get out. And the same is true for prison settings. And I think that includes children. The reason I want to mention Dr. Milton, I think she knows about this contract, this grant that I'm very proud we got last year. I think I mentioned this on Dr. Maxey's show before, but we got a $1.3 million 5 years grant for trauma recovery. So I've got a young psychologist in my department. I always try to kind of whittle it down is there's trauma. A lot of it's gun violence, but it could be a car wreck or any kind of trauma. And the family and everybody shows up, and the young person, the officer, the young man, is rushed to the emergency room and into the surgical operatory lab area, and surgeons are coming, anesthesia, blah, 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 all the bells and whistles to operate on the person who had the acute trauma. My team goes to the waiting room to deal with the young 9-year-old boy who sees his father or his uncle or his brother who's been a victim of trauma. And they start trying to very early work to address the thought processes, manage the emotions, and particularly try to block and bifurcate this consideration that one has to immediately be about what I call the negative concerns of retribution and retaliation and all that kind of stuff, and be thinking of what this really means to them in that regard, kind of going forward. How we interface with children, Dr. Neighbor Stevens, from the inception of a young man going to jail or prison in New Orleans matters. I think it's a healthcare issue for mental professionals like ourselves, people like Walks and I. And I think it's essential because otherwise, I think you're 100% right, Dr. Neighbor Stevens. We continue to get the same cycle of violence repeating itself because folks are learning to be violent when they're watching or when they're 9 years old, metaphorically, and they're watching a relative go through the process of being a victim of trauma. I'd love to ask Dr. Milton to make any comments about that, Dr. Maxey, if I can.
Go ahead.
I think that that we have made some progress in society, but there's just things that people in our community and our families, there's conversations that we just have not had. And having those conversations and calling a thing, understanding, you know, what mental health disorder they're seeing and what kind of support they need, I think is going to be key. To have the family understand even some of the symptoms, like what is mania, you know, what is psychosis, so that they can also advocate for their family member when they do return to society and help them manage their mental health care long term.
So I have a question. I'm going to ask Dr. Walsh to forgive me for asking you such a sophomore question, but I have to ask it. Dr. Walsh, don't kill me.
Never.
Is there an ethnic derivation of what group or why people commit serial murders? Is there any evidence that there's one group that does that more than anybody else? Dr. Bailey?
I'm sorry, I thought you said Walks.
No,
Yeah,
no. I asked Dr. Walks always tried to keep me straight.
Right. It's a great point, and I'll give you the long version. Once I was in D.C., arbitrarily in D.C. for probably a national medical event, and there was a shooting. You guys remember this? It was the guy that was shooting people from the trunk of his car. Remember that whole story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Years ago. It was a grown man, and then I guess he had a young boy with him, 60 or whatever, like. And they grabbed me and they kind of put me on. I was live on one of the CBS with affiliates there in the DC area. And I shared what we think we know is that the numbers are equivocal. We really cannot say that those numbers are substantively different in our society. I was very fortunate, Dr. Walks and Dr. Maxey, because I was correct. So on that issue, the numbers are correct. That they are, we cannot differentiate in a fashion that's statistically significant. What we do know, though, is that certain kinds of violence and crime, criminal activity by the media is displayed differently. Mm-hmm. And serial killers are displayed in the media consistently to be a lot more likely to be Caucasian. Interpersonal violence, homicides, if you will, that's interpersonal, are a lot more likely to be played up in the media as African American, and we have data on this now. So we have to be very cautious about what the numbers show and what our thoughts are, because we tend to think that what you're seeing in the media that is fair balanced. And I think this is one area. So it's a very shrewd question, Dr. Maxey, that some early data has shown is not fair balanced. And if you think about it, if there's more than one violent act in a city every day, and often there are, media gets to choose which one they're going to show. There's no guarantee that they'll tell the whole story each day. So picking the one that's the most salacious may be what kind of drives ratings. But this issue of whether or not we have data saying that serial killers, for example, are a lot more likely to be of one race or the background than another, I'm pretty sure the data, Dr. Maxey, is equivocal. I can argue, though, or share with you that that depends on how you define serial killers. And that's changed during my career. Now, you have to have 4 or 5 for it to be viewed as a serial killing. Early in my career, 3 was the magic number. So by increasing the number of persons that kind of be killed, I know it's a tough conversation, in a certain type setting, that certainly changed the number of people who are indiscriminately involved. So quite a topic of discussion, a timely question, Dr. Maxey, one that I think has some subtleties to it, but I think I've described for you the data as it currently exists in psychiatry.
Okay. What prompted my question? I recently read a book by an author named Wilbur Smith called Nemesis, and it described how families carried in an intergenerational period of revenge from some perceived wrong done years ago. And that was just a question I had. Dr. Walks, any ideas that you have in general to Dr. Walks? Dr. Bailey?
Thank you, Dr. Maxey. Dr. Bailey, having worked myself in correctional setting, and there's so many individual areas of questions that I have, and I think of them as opportunities for you to bring your scienced eye to and look at them. One is just the challenge of moving into an area where 93% of the people look like us, and how that impacts you when you. I remember walking into state prison and saying, is there a separate prison for the white folks? Because it's worrisome to walk in and realize that so many of the folks look like us. But my question for you today is, in the correction system, it isn't just I'm going to diagnose and treat. There's also the correctional officers and that hierarchy and how they interact with you with respect to what you think may be best for your patients. Specifically, I remember working on the cell block with the most serious and persistently mentally ill folks who don't leave their cell ever, except for going down to the shower at the end of the block once a week and coming back. But there's no 1 hour outside, there's no daylight outside. And so it just bothered me so much that people can be locked away literally for years and never leave that area. And so the question is, how do you try to do therapeutic care? I know you just started the contract, and this is one of those things that's going to take a little while to try to sort out, but the relationship between the caregivers and the correctional officers, and how monumentally challenging it is to work with someone to improve their mental health when they are literally stuck in a box 24/7.
Again, timely. I think that the issue of addressing, understanding, managing, working with as partners and not adversaries, the custody staff or the corrections officers, Dr. Walks, is going to be significant in our ability to have any chance at having a successful transition and successful outcomes. I was mentioning to a different person earlier today that one of the problems is just not having enough people. So I think the concept, they probably need 1,500 correctional officers inside that jail for custody, and they're probably running around 1,000 most of the time. Every now and then, some days they dip a little bit below it. So they're a person or two down, as an understatement. I also think, though, that getting them on board is helpful. Clearly, officers have a lot to say and a lot to do, but the people they interface with, they watch them. They have longer shifts than the clinicians. They're there watching that same person regularly. They can give information that can be pro or con, very helpful, or not otherwise for a particular person or individual, I think, in a jail setting. I also think that officers all too often may bring a issue of institutional knowledge and how that jail or prison works. They also may live in the same community. I'm always thoughtful about the fact that years ago, there was a big lawsuit in Memphis, I think it was, where the city sued and won, if I'm correct. They wanted a person to work in these public services, police and fire, and custody staff to live in the city. Right. And there are different reasons for that, paying taxes or whatever may be one of them. But one reason, that's a good reason, could be you may know the people. And if you know them, you may have a better idea of what some of the things you can say to, to the water on the fire and decrease, a growing animosity leading conflict that could lead to a fight or big conflict. So I think you make a very good point. We are new at this, starting Monday, but we got a huge responsibility. And I think getting to know the custody staff well, showing them the level, I think, of respect and deference that I think is deserved and roles are in, because they manage very tough roles, especially if they're already understaffed. Often it's one person standing there when it should be two, if you will, and recognizing that they're not there to harm us. I mean, very often the doctors want you to move fast and get this patient in, get so much work done, and we can't move or do much until custody gets a person to us in the right situation or setting. So again, your show is timely, Dr. Maxey, and Dr. Walker's question is another, just like Dr. David Stevens' question. These, I think, are the operational questions of the day and things that we're going to have to be attentive to.
We certainly thank you. Before we ask you for final comment, Dr. David Stevens, are any questions in the chat that any of our viewing audience has?
Dr. Gibson had a question early on about the diet. How are the dietary needs met of the persons who are incarcerated?
Yeah, I saw that. Excuse me, Dr. Gibson, for not answering earlier. Clearly, there's a full court press. One thing I should mention to all your listeners, Dr. Maxey, is if things fail in this setting, I don't know that it's because of lack of money. I mean, these are big contracts. If I didn't say it earlier, the one I'm speaking to is $110 million over 5 years, or about $22 million a year. Just our component, psychiatry, was supposed to be initially listed at $4.5 million, about $3 million for what they call mental health, about $1.5 million for what they call psychiatry, which is psychiatrists seeing patients write prescriptions or put people in the hospital. Mental health is all of the staff and all the workers doing one-on-ones, doing therapy. There's a lot more bandwidth, I think, to that piece, but that many would see mental health and psychiatry has been a bit different. It's also kind of interesting, but together, probably about $4.5 million a year. I think that there's a full dietitian. I mean, if you come into the jail setting, you get a full evaluation for what you can eat and shouldn't eat. Now, I doubt anybody's going to stand in line arguing that they want this food versus that food. I think that's probably true, but that you can get an evaluation for if there's anything to particularly be mindful of. Watching a high salt diet, for example. A lot of patients have diabetes, so decreasing, giving them a high sugary dessert. Those kind of things do happen. And to the best of my knowledge, knock on wood, those aspects of what happens in the jail are happening correctly, which is good news.
Well, thank you. And I certainly appreciate you being with us today and the information that you've been able to talk about, and like to invite you for final comments and also your wonderful resident guests.
Yeah, my comments will be very brief. I think that as typical, your show does one thing that we need essentially, helps educate, I think, our society and our community and our public about the issues of our day. These issues are real. They're not just about being African American. These are everybody's issues. And not really just about having general healthcare problems, but I think mental health problems very often carry over into the larger patient substrate. So I think these issues are timely. I also think that we want to always be trying to recruit young people to go into medicine in general in our area, psychiatry, psychology. Very happy, you're right, that you allowed Dr. Milton to join. I hope that she'll get involved in this research and be able to come on one day to discuss with you some of our own projects, and hopefully some of the things we're doing at LSU will help her, motivate her in her career kind of going forward. I hope that she'll stay in academics. I tell her that all the time. I hope she'll stay in New Orleans. We need good quality docs here doing some of that high quality work like what we heard Michelle Clark speak about earlier. I end with saying, though, that I think that if we can work together to decrease the stigma against people in jails or prisons, it could be a harbinger. We also got to work together to decrease the stigma against having mental illness that a lot of folks carry and continue and perpetuate, which I think is synonymous with decreasing the stigma against being Black or African American or ethnic minority. Those issues, I think, are counterproductive. Those stigma-based concerns don't help change the world or make things better. They don't move us toward enhanced or more proficient outcomes. They just kind of muddy the waters limit the funding that we need at the national level and ensure that misinformation remains manifest, which we should work to avoid. So this show is helpful. Hope the information we share with you is beneficial. And I promise to give it a year and maybe come back on and discuss a bit more with you about hopefully some gains we made. I'd love simply for us to be able to get off the consent decree. If I can simply do that, Dr. Maxey, I think the sheriff will be very, very happy with my work. I'll say the final comments for Dr. Milton.
Dr. Milton?
I want to thank you all for this opportunity to be in this group with all these esteemed physicians and healthcare professionals. I would say mentorship matters. You have a generation of physicians that want to help, but we don't know exactly how to do it. So being in these conversations, in these rooms, and showing us how to navigate the systems and navigate institutions so that we can have impact is a way that we will see change. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Dr. Ivan Walks, final comments?
Thank you, Dr. Maxey. I want to thank my friend, Dr. Bailey, so much for his leadership, not only where he is now at LSU, but his leadership in the broader medical community. I want to thank Dr. Milton. Dr. Milton mentioned mentorship. No place better than to be hanging with Dr. Bailey with respect to mentorship. And also want to mention Dr. Clark. And it seems like from a psychiatry perspective, from a mental health perspective, that there is, I don't know, maybe as deep or even a deeper connection to this term, our people. There's a personal commitment and passion that we get clearly evidenced with the work of Dr. Bailey and Dr. Clark and the work they continue to do. And I think that so many of those little micro insults that we talk about from time to time that impact us, just being Black in America, looking at the prison populations, looking at the missed opportunities for our families to break cycles that are destructive, that are traumatic, that are just plain old inappropriate. Dr. Bailey mentioned throwing people away. We think as a society that we can just throw people in prison, and that term is used. We're going to throw you in jail. There is something about making sure that when people do get out, that, as Dr. Clark was talking about, that there's something that recognizes that there's humanity and there's a humane approach to dealing with people. So I just want to applaud Dr. Clark, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Milton, and all the other folks who are looking at changing the psychology of our country and hopefully our planet to just valuing humans and being willing to put in some time with those of us that have, for a variety of reasons, found ourselves in a difficult situation.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Dr. Neighbor-Stevens.
Well, I want to thank everyone who has joined in this conversation today. This is one of these conversations that I'm so happy will be archived and available on YouTube, because it's something that we're going to need to take a look at again and again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, and appreciate both you and Dr. Walks and Dr. Bailey. You knocked it out the park again, and you're bringing these young psychiatrists up with us. We're looking forward to seeing her again. And I want to wish everybody a great, great weekend and the rest of the Sunday. And thank you again, Simon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Good job.